We've heard these words of Margaret Fuller, and they sound like they might have come out of the 1970s during the midst of the feminist movement, but they came out of the 1840s. She was an incredible woman, and I was listening to the music today, the Bread and Roses and the marching and the song that Susan just did, and it's just the whole crux of that whole movement of just recognizing the humanity of women. And Margaret Fuller added so much to that. I think that one of the things was she was so strange to everybody around her because she did not fit the role that was prescribed to women. That Edgar Allan Poe said, there are men, there are women, and then there is Margaret Fuller, an entirely different creature. And I think we owe a lot to her. Give a brief synopsis of her life. She was born Sarah Margaret Fuller on May 23rd, 1810 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her father was a politician who made sure that she was schooled in Greek and Latin and classical literature, making translations at age 6. This was very unusual for women of her day. It was very unusual for humans of her day. And although her family was too poor to send her to college, she became friends with many of the students at Harvard. Startling them with her quick wit, fearless questioning, she supported herself by teaching school. And she joined the Transcendental Club in 1837 and was considered a peer by the greatest thinkers of the day, including Emerson, Thoreau, Unitarian ministers James Freeman Clarke and Theodore Parker, and Frederick Henry Hedge. She was an anomaly. Both men and women didn't know what to do with her, because Margaret knew that women were capable of advanced thought. From 1839 to 1844, she held a series of gatherings in a bookstore known as Conversations, designed to give women an opportunity to just talk and to explore their deep spiritual and philosophical and the social issues of the day. In 1840, when Emerson decided to publish a magazine to promote transcendentalism, he appointed Margaret Fuller to be the editor, for she was the one who was a literary critic and more well-read than any of them. As the editor, she wrote many articles, and I've seen microfiche of this magazine in a library up in Wisconsin, and it's so amazing. You see these little articles of, Thoreau saying Hinduism, and they're just all the art, and she did a lot to introduce Goethe, the philosopher, to America, doing some translations there. In 1843, she traveled to my neck of the woods up in the Great Lakes region and reported the lives of the settlers and the Native Americans there. In her book, Summer on the Lakes, she wrote, "Let the missionary, instead of preaching to the Indian, preach to the trader who ruins the Indian." She then went to work for Horace Greeley as a social and literary critic for the New York Tribune. Her criticism was sharp and not always kind. For example, her review of an essay defending capital punishment began, "We have had this book before us for several weeks, but the task of reading it has been so repulsive that we have been obliged to get through it by short stages with long intervals of rest. And we have only just reached the end. Of the whole, we will say briefly that its premises are monstrous, its reading sophistical, its conclusions absurd, and its spirit diabolic." I think she just liked the book. In 1846, she began to tour Europe, continuing to write for the New York Tribune. And eventually she married an Italian soldier who fought for the losing side in a socialist uprising. They had a son, and after their defeat, they set sail for America. 50 yards from the United States shore, their boat was shipwrecked, and they died, and she was only 40 years old. Her writings are her legacy. She lived from 1810 to 1850. Early in her career, she focused mostly on transcendentalist themes of individualism and direct experience of God, unfettered by creeds and dogma. Here's a description of a spiritual experience she had on a cold November's day in the woods. I came to where the trees were thick about a little pool. I sat down there. I did not think. All was dark, cold, and still. Suddenly the sun shone out with that transparent sweetness, like the last smile of a dying lover, which it will use even when it has been unkind all a cold autumn day. And even then passed into my thought a beam from its true sun. I saw that there was no self, that selfishness was all folly and the result of circumstance, that it was only because I thought the self real that I suffered, that I only had to live the ideal of the all, and all was mine. This truth came to me, and I received it unhesitatingly, so that for that hour I was taken up to God. In that true way, most of the relations of the earth seemed mere films and phenomena. This experience helped her to see that at a deeper core, there was no difference between men and women. It gave her the confidence to seek out the truth, confident that God's knowledge was accessible to her. She said she has disappointed with Unitarianism. She liked Channing, the founder of the thing, but said most churchmen are not like him. She liked to keep her options open, writing, "I have determined not to form settled opinions at present. Loving or feeble natures need a positive religion, a visible refuge, a protection, as much in the passionate season of youth as in those stages nearer to the grave. But mine is not such. I believe in eternal progression. I believe in a God, a beauty and perfection to which I am to strive all my life for assimilation." This statement would seem bold to many listeners even today. Imagine how it must have sounded to the listeners in the 1840s. From her spirituality, she naturally evolved into feminism. Emerson received accolades for his spirituality based on the self-reliance. He was a man. For Margaret, as a woman talking about self-reliance, she was branded as being out of her sphere. She wrote, "Religion was early awakened in my soul, a sense that what the soul is capable of, to ask it must attain. I must depend on myself as the only constant friend. This self-dependence, which is an honor in me, is depreciated as a fault in most women. They are taught to learn their rule from without or from outside of themselves, not to unfold it from within. Her book, Woman in the 19th Century, was published in 1845, and we read some of it today together. We would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down. We would have every path laid open to women as freely as to men. Were this done, we believe the divine energy would pervade nature to a degree unknown in the history of former ages. A ravishing harmony of spheres would ensue, when inward and outward freedom for women as much as for man shall be acknowledged as a right and not yielded as a concession. She believed that the freedom of women was necessary for the freedom of all humanity. To her, our common race was more important than all of our differences. She wrote, "Male and female represent two sides of the great radical dualism, but in fact, they are perpetually passing into one another. Fluid hardens into solid, solid rushes into fluid. There is no wholly masculine man, nor purely feminine woman." Her spirituality made her think of herself as part of the divine. But her mystical world did have its downside. She was prone to discuss ideals rather than how to change the present reality. For example, she would write eloquently how slavery betrayed the ideal of freedom in the United States, yet she never joined an abolition group. She was, in many ways, the ivory tower, and that was what she was criticized by people. James Russell Lowell, who was a target of her critiques, and we've heard some of her critiques, I imagine they might have been harsh, fired back this satirical poem about Margaret Fuller. "She will take an old notion and make it her own, by saying it o'er in a sibylline tone, or persuade you 'tis something incredibly deep, by repeating it as if to put you to sleep. And she well may defy any mortal to see through it, when once she has mixed up her infinite me through it." But going to Europe transformed her. She found herself in the middle of a revolution where it was impossible to stay neutral. She cared for the wounded and wrote to friends in the States, "I forget the great ideas to sympathize with the poor mothers who had nursed their precious sons only to see them all lopped and gashed." Her optimism was lessened. "I shall never again be religiously generous, so terribly do I need for myself the love I have given to other sufferers. O God, help me," is all I cry. Yet I have so little faith in the paternal love I need. So ruthless or so negligent seems the government of the earth. I feel calm, yet sternly towards fate. But in the midst of this despair, she wrote of the pure delight she had in her marriage and her son. Many have speculated about what would have happened if she survived. Would she have come back to the United States and returned to her intellectual critiques of society? Or would the taste of revolution lead her to political activism in this country? Or would the pain of revolution have caused her to retreat into the quietude of family life? Her death left much unfinished business. we as Unitarian Universalists have inherited this unfinished business. While the past century and a half have brought much progress in the rights of minorities and women's, there is much yet to be done. We boldly assert the legacy of self-determination as far as spirituality is concerned, the idea of God not being a frozen thing, but an eternal progression of beauty into which we assimilate ourselves, is much closer to where we are today. But do we want our denomination to be an elite group of esoteric idealists? Or do we want to be a fellowship that makes our ideals real in the hearts of many people? We've been active in abolition and civil rights for over a century and a half. Yet most in our congregation are very white. Why is this? Our universalism proclaims that all are saved, yet our congregations tend to contain mostly college-educated professionals. And why is that? We encourage a diversity of theological opinion, yet we often presume that everyone's political ideology should be left of the Green Party. And why is that? How do we put our ideals into practice? There is comfort in gathering each week to dream about the ideals, the things that make us as a faith movement unique. But there is discomfort when we leave these doors and have to put those ideals into practice in our family and at work and in the larger community. If we get our hands dirty, we will be changed. The despair that was Margaret Fuller's would probably be ours, because in the real world, our ideals get messy. In a book of Unitarian Universalist evangelism entitled Salted with Fire, Reverend Robert Kernan wrote, "The growing and inclusive congregation means that each of us must confront the racism, class phobia, ageism, genderism, homophobia, and all the other prejudices that we hold privately." His congregation grew from 100 to 700 people in 10 years by taking risks. He wrote, "We are human, and we have made mistakes in this quest for deepening and opening. To learn is to err time and time again. But we seek to do so openly and in the community of many who are searching as well to create a context of truthfulness and spiritual forming. To come into such a place, and it is both a relief and a challenge. It is as radically Unitarian Universalist as we can make it. It is a heavenly mixture of political, spiritual, theological, and social transformation. Before us lies that challenge to live our Unitarian Universalism, to live our ideals to the fullest. Let us take those risks of allowing our ideals to evolve into reality. We can listen to that deep yearning inside of us. We can feel the divine spark kindling in our hearts. We can allow our essence to move in rhythm with the universe. We can live a fuller life when our connection to the ultimate produces a connection with one another. When we share our religious experience with others, as we invite others to tell their stories and to increase our awareness. Our Unitarian Universalist tradition is one that encourages a strong individualism as we each choose our own spiritual path. But our individualism must be placed in the context of community. Only as we interact with our family, our fellowship, our co-worker, people who we perceive as different, and those who seem similar, only we, as we interact with them, do we fully live. We're creating something new here, even though we have an old tradition. To paraphrase Poe, when people see us, they will probably say, well, there are religious people, and there are non-religious people, and then there are Unitarian Universalists. May we bless and be blessed.